Good morning, everyone. Gregg Garfin, School of Natural Resources, Institute of the Environment, and CLIMAS affiliate. And I'm joined by my colleague, Sarah LeRoy, who works for CLIMAS and a raft of other projects. And we're going to speak about heat, health, science, and people in the Paso del Norte region, which includes Las Cruces, New Mexico, and pictured here, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. We are accidental tourists in this turf of climate and health. We got there through a kind of circuitous route in working on climate impacts and extremes, which, as you know, for our region in the intermountain part of the Southwest tends to be either too much water, too little water, it's too darn hot, or the combination of that leads to bad things like fire. And it affects major and minor cities that often back up against mountain ranges and have large, rapidly expanding urban footprints in our region. So over a number of years, we've worked a lot with cities in the Intermountain Southwest, and I've also been doing a little bit of work on the US-Mexico border through something called the North American Climate Services Partnership. And one of the things that we've noticed is that the discourse has kind of changed from, in our early projects, climate change and climate adaptation to extremes and the single event that might kick you in the pants real hard if you're not prepared for it. So in working with these Intermountain West cities, they identified public health risks of extreme heat as their #1 concern. And that one of the reasons I think that it's important for them is it's something that they feel like they have some control over and can make some positive contributions to reducing or managing the urban heat island effect, which amplifies the heat in urban areas and amplifies the risk. So through this combination of working with cities, working at the border, we got invited to take part in the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, which is a new initiative. It's a partnership between NOAA and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And it's an integrated information system, so it's providing climate services much in the way that CLIMAS does, but in a kind of expanded national network sort of way. So we've got regional pilot projects, experiments, research that we can learn from. There's a lot of developing trust relationships with stakeholders to move together in partnership to communicate science, to develop science questions. There are a lot of different agencies and players in the project. And it's highly interdisciplinary because the project is complex. We are leading the North American Desert Pilot Project in the Paso del Norte region. And the ultimate goal of this is to provide improved early warning and preparedness through a combination of forecasts, research, capacity building, and communication. And Sarah will talk more about what we've done over the last couple of years.
They said the arrows work. That's it. Okay. Okay, so yes, I'm going to talk about what we've done over the last year and a half or so in the region. I've organized this part of our talk in terms of a timeline, which you can see across the top, with milestones of things that we've done across the along the way. And I've also put a map in here to just remind you of where the region is that we're talking about. Las Cruces, El Paso, and Ciudad Juarez, also known as the Paso del Norte region. So we held a kickoff workshop for this pilot project back in July of last year. Prior to July, we created a steering committee made up of people in the region from all sorts of different areas. And then, so the kickoff workshop was about 70 people. Again, it was from people in the area, but also nationally and internationally. There were some federal partners in Mexico, for example. And these were made, emergency managers, people in the public health sector, public safety, energy, sustainability, academia, practitioner community, government. And the key thing that happened at this workshop is that we created work streams, essentially working groups organized around a thematic area. So the 5 work streams, or 5 thematic areas, are historical climatology and vulnerability. Linkages between heat parameters and health outcomes. The predictions group, this group, the prediction, outlook, and early warning group. So this is where forecasting comes into play, right? Improved forecasts for extreme heat events. Capacity building and training group, and then a communication and engagement group. And their work focuses on communicating with the public and other sectors and effective ways of doing so. And then, so one of the big goals of this workshop, right, was to create gaps or establish gaps and needs in this area of research. And these are the big challenges that the participants identified at the workshop. So translation of climate and health research into evidence-driven intervention, a co-production of discipline-specific environmental and health information, the evolving risk communication strategies to drive behavior changes, enhanced coordination and communication among emergency management and public health entities and between those 2 entities, and then improved public health surveillance and monitoring. And this was actually a very big common gap that came up in this workshop that I think is pretty common among a lot of cities, which is recording of extreme heat deaths and illnesses at hospitals. And without that information, it's hard to really do this research. And then the next steps that the participants thought of for the next few months really were organized around creating like a baseline information. So a state of knowledge assessment, for example, existing data and initiatives that are already going on in the region. And then at a community level too, and this was through a survey that they wanted to distribute in El Paso and Las Cruces to determine the existing knowledge within the community regarding extreme heat. And then volunteers from each of these working groups agreed to meet via teleconference regularly. So prior to this January work streams meeting, like I said, it's the work streams decided they met regularly and we started developing these various products. So in January of this year, the work streams met in person, and the real goal of this workshop was to start planning ahead of time for the upcoming heat season for this year. And these are the 4 large ideas that came out of this workshop in terms of what they wanted to do for the upcoming heat season. Those were to develop a binational task force, and then more specifically to connect with local media and the Extreme Weather Task Force in El Paso to hold a press event. They wanted to hold a tactical urban style event like Cyclovia here in Tucson to distribute extreme heat awareness materials. And then the biggest thing that came out of this is they decided to declare May as Heat Awareness Month. And they wanted to have proclamations by each of the mayors in each city and have like a coordinated effort over the course of the month. Something I did forget to mention is that during this time period between July and January, the team decided to add another work stream, which is related to infrastructure improvement. This was spearheaded by the Chief Resilience Officer in El Paso. This is kind of her bread and butter, which is mitigating the urban heat island effect through improving infrastructure. They also decided they wanted to create a project website. This would create an online presence for funding opportunities, as well as create a space for communicating between the project and the public, as well as amongst members of the project. And then we decided to apply for a few funding opportunities. This was also the time that we started really engaging with the Office of Resilience in Ciudad Juarez. They invited Gregg to come to Ciudad Juarez and give a talk. So we all trekked across the border. Keith actually came with us for this. And they are very engaged and very enthusiastic about all of this and really run with it and done their own thing, which is great, but also kept connected with El Paso and Las Cruces. So between January and May, the team spent most of their time preparing for this Heat Awareness Month. They created brochures in both English and Spanish, created infographics. We created that website that I mentioned. And then for Heat Awareness Month, each of the cities did something different. They did do a proclamation, as I mentioned. They had kind of staggered, you know, one at the beginning, one at the end. And then Las Cruces handed out materials at their local farmers market. They also distributed the community vulnerability survey that I mentioned earlier. El Paso developed maps of cooling centers and bus stops. And then Ciudad Juarez really went above and beyond and did 10 actions in 10 days. They went to a local elementary school to talk to children about extreme heat and the risks of extreme heat. And they also, they had a tree planting event, they had an art event. It was pretty encouraging, everything that they did. And then also during this time, Greg and myself and a couple of the other partners applied for and received a How Received grant. So the point of this project, it fits with this NIHHIS vision of communicating and engaging with vulnerable populations at a community level, a neighborhood level. So the populations that we're targeting are colonia residents. So colonias are unregulated communities along the US-Mexico border that often lack necessities such as indoor plumbing and electricity. This is a picture of the colonia that we'll be working with. And they'll also be working with pregnant women and infants. And the idea here is that we're going to train community health workers in the risks of extreme heat, and then they will take that information to the community in the hopes of reducing their vulnerability to extreme heat events. We also plan to retrofit colonia homes with low-cost cooling techniques such as weatherization. And then we're going to begin development of a border-wide learning network, with which Greg is going to talk about in a minute. So then the most recent meeting that we had was in August of this year. There were two key parts of this meeting. One, we wanted to talk about the heat season that had occurred and discuss lessons learned from that. For example, they didn't really think that the mayoral proclamations was worth the effort. What they did think would be worth the effort is to have press conferences with a celebrity or like a TV meteorologist. And they think that that would have more leeway with the public. They also said we needed a cute icon instead of the infographic that we developed. So maybe like an evil sun with sunglasses, and then create some sort of jingle, something that resonates with children more. But the key was really maintaining communication and knowledge exchange between all of the cities. And then Las Cruces did distribute their community vulnerability survey, and I do have results if you guys want to talk about that later. And then the second part of this workshop was ideas for how they can sustain the initiative moving forward. So it was brought up at this workshop that extreme heat is not a sexy topic, but that sustainability is a sexy topic. So one of the groups suggested framing it through the lens of sustainability. And that's what this diagram shows. But specific next steps, which we really wanted them to focus on, was they've agreed to do bi-monthly teleconferences with the steering committee, and then they still want to hold these annual meetings to share ideas and maintain partnerships. So this is the logic model for this project, and what I really wanted to focus on, we talked about most of this already, is these long-term outcomes that we hope we have started these already and that they will improve, but essentially creating new relationships between the cities, new research and outreach partnerships, and then increased neighborhood level capacity, as well as an increased awareness of extreme heat events and improved communication and coordination for early warning.
So we have this beautiful relationship with folks in the Paso del Norte region that now the challenge is, like with all relationships, how do you nourish it and sustain it over time? And one of the things we built into our Howard proposal is a little bit of an experiment, because we know that we're not the ones that farthest out there on this issue. We know that other folks are working on it. Erica just talked about it. I'll just mention Texas is not a BRACE state, nor is New Mexico. So we're kind of filling the gap that BRACE might have provided. Anyway, we think that there are other groups like this. And over the course of this year, we'll be reaching out to them to create a kind of research and practice network. And we'll do this as an experiment for the 2018 heat season. And if we think that it's been successful and that people want to be engaged, then we'll pursue further funding to sustain a broader sort of coast-to-coast network. And that'll be part of the NIHHIS network. So in summing this up, I think Sarah made a pretty good case that we're doing well on community engagement. We're learning about training through the Howry Project. NOAA has a lot of capacity through the Climate Prediction Center and through the Weather Service on prediction and early warning. We've got really good partners working on green infrastructure to reduce urban heat island effects. We've got some grasp on climate history and vulnerability, and we know that our colleague Dave Dubois will be working with folks in Las Cruces a little more closely on that. But our big gap is this linkage between heat indicators and health outcomes. And in that regard, we're a little bit like Popeye. We've got big forearms, but really lousy biceps. So we need some kind of spinach to help develop our biceps. And as we move forward to sustain the relationship and develop this border to or coast to coast border network, the spinach that we're probably going to need is funding. And the thing that is encouraging to me is that we have new collaborative groups that are working on developing projects. We were successful with the Howry Grant, successful with a NASA developed project for Las Cruces. We failed with a proposal to the EPA's Border 2020 program, but we're still all communicating and looking for these opportunities. And that's really all I had to say. I suspect that many of you will have good ideas about sustaining networks, about things that we might want to add to our portfolio. And this is our contact information, and we are all ears. Yes.
So with the gap with the health linkages, is that more, do you think that's more because hospitals don't really track it and so it's hard to get that data, or what would you?
So there's a little bit of that, and part of what we've done is developed a database. In fact, Vince did this work of the metadata for these research data sets. So we've got a foothold on that. The other thing is, I think we need to go back and kind of lock people in a room and have a really much more detailed conversation on what would be the useful forecast lead time for this kind of public health outcome. And again, to really home in on what are the indicators. We've got some good guesses, and we can look at other places like Maricopa County to figure that out. But we really need to hear it from the public health and weather and climate folks in the region.
We had a major change in the climate that was not predicted. Indeed, we used to have a monsoon that went on through September. For 18 years in a row now, August has dried out. And so, is this regional, or I'm thinking of Tucson, Phoenix. Has this change impacted your entire study area, or do you have different magnitudes and styles of human-induced climate change affecting different parts of your study area?
Yeah, so there's a lot of variability across the monsoon region. There's a tendency for, if it's particularly good here in the more western part of the region, for it to be a little wimpier in the eastern part of the region and vice versa. And there's also variability north-south across the monsoon region. So I don't believe we've seen a consistent case where August is drying out as it did this year in Tucson.
This year was the 18th year in a row, consecutive year, that the changes occurred compared. So that's starting to look like.
I'll take a closer look at it with our weather service colleagues in El Paso. Other comments, questions, Andrew?
So Greg,
Provost
the infrastructure issue and the who's affected issue, the who's affected part is highly dependent on socioeconomic status and even geographically across some of these cities, because it obviously ties closely to SES as well as age, based on other studies. So did you find that the groups were interested in sort of broad brush interventions, sons with sunglasses on and PSAs and so forth, or was there some interest in going into places that really made a difference, schooling centers, moving the elderly, to different places? I mean, the kind of mechanical interventions that you need, like the day the heat hits.
Yeah, it's the latter. They really are interested in having more strategic engagement. And that's why the cities wanted to deploy this survey to understand, to get some ground truthing for some research that colleagues at the University of Texas at El Paso have done on vulnerability to extreme heat. So they really wanted to get down to the neighborhood level. And from what we're learning with Pima County, it's not necessarily the elderly and the very young that are always the most vulnerable. So we really kind of want to get in there with public health folks and home in at the neighborhood. And that's, again, a matter of finding the right call for proposals so that we can do some more research. El Paso, Las Cruces deployed the survey, and Juarez is planning to. El Paso had a little bit of a political problem deploying the survey. They were gung-ho to do it. They got to the starting line, and then they're kind of frozen.
There was a restructuring in the cities, kind of like what happened here.
City government.
Sustainability offices. But I wanted to add that the vulnerability survey in Las Cruces, the sustainability officer was actually able to use those results as like a basis for creating green infrastructure in the neighborhood. But I want to say that the things that you pointed out, those are also the harder ones to do. It was much easier to do public service campaigns and things like that than it is to change the structure of how things are.
Yeah, and so, really, this whole thing has been, where can we get a foothold so that we can keep moving?
So on that specific question of targeting, strategically targeting efforts in a timely way, the data's there. The hospitals have information. The emergency management people have the ability to get it out, but it's like a puzzle that's not been put together yet. They're not quite communicating everything in a way that's demonstrable, replicable, and transferable to other places. It's just there and waiting for a little bit.
Well, it's a little bit like drought, it's not a problem until the day that it's a problem. The water stops flowing or the people start dying, whatever it is.
You said something really interesting.
Reaction, everybody's all one.
The stuff that's 10 and 20 years old on heat health warnings are not generally from southwestern cities because we're well adapted to heat. So they tend to be from northern tier cities or places that don't have a lot of air conditioning. And that's where the elderly and tenements and whatever and those kind of cities see the impact. So there's an opportunity to build out what that would look like here. I think you sort of hinted at that because it may not be the same kinds of communities and vulnerabilities here in our setting where most of the time we're okay unless it's a truly exceptional event like that. And what would catastrophic look like here? and which communities would those look like when, you know, we have things that happen in Europe? What was the France heat wave, 15,000 excess deaths or something like this. And the Southwest hasn't really seen that yet, and may not for a little while, but at some point something like that's going to happen when our adaptation strategies fail,
When
right?
mosquitoes start dying, we'll know.
I think that's actually,
Question.
Me?
One more. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, this has to do with the heat island effect and brick buildings. In 1995, I was finishing my bachelor's final. And I was walking from University north on Park after sundown, midsummer. And I got to those brick buildings there and the heat radiation was so tremendous it almost pushed me into the street. And I've always thought if we could get everybody to paint those brick buildings white, it might make quite a difference. I know they wouldn't want to, but would it actually affect?
Well, our colleagues at ASU have done a little bit of work on that in terms of white roofs. It turns out, you know, you can't like make the heat go away.
No, you can't make it go away, but would it help
You can reflect it, but it's still in the lower atmosphere and it still affects
But
us.
the walls hold it and then radiate it out at night, which is why the temperature doesn't go down.
We'll look into it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
thanks, Greg and Sarah.